Good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C., and a very good afternoon and a good evening to our colleagues and friends around the globe that have joined us today. My name is Barbara Langley, and I'm CIPE's Director for the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment. I'll be your moderator for this very important panel session on how to recover inclusively. In our first two panels, we explored pathways to economic recovery and openings for democratic transition and the defense of institutions. But none of this matters if recovery and renewal are for the few or for certain categories of people. That would neither be sustainable nor democratic. Think about the demographic of the political leaders who are taking decisions on pandemic health and economic restrictions, and now on economic recovery. How many of them represent marginalized populations, such as women, youth, persons with disabilities, ethnic or racial minorities, or LGBTI+, among others? Equality of economic opportunity gives people options and gives them a stake in democratic society. However, the pandemic restrictions have exacerbated disparities and inequalities since the pandemic started. For example, even here in the United States alone, women have left the workforce in droves, as the sectors most impacted by these restrictions often employ the most women, and many women have chosen to focus on the care of children or elderly in their families during this time. As we look to economic recovery, marginalized populations have largely missed out on relief efforts, and many have been voiceless in policies for crisis response. How can we ensure that the policymakers ensure an equitable recovery? And how can leaders within these marginalized groups help the policymakers shape the way we think about recovery? To help us explore this important question, we've asked 4 of CIPE's local partners to join us today and offer their perspective. I'm very pleased to introduce some of my friends and colleagues today. First, from the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we have Toki Mabogunye. Toki has done quite a bit of work on women's empowerment and SME service development. Jehan Ara joins us from Catalyst Labs, formerly Pakistan Software Houses Association, and her background includes incubating youth startups and advocacy on ICT policy and the cybercrime bill. Ron Astilas is with the Philippines LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And as we celebrate Pride Month here in the US, I'm so pleased to have Ron here to discuss recovering with pride. Manija Wafek is with the Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And AWCCI, as we call it more often, with Manija's leadership, has just launched a women's business agenda, which is solidifying AWCCI's leadership in private sector advocacy engagement across the business community in Afghanistan. Please note that you can view further details on the bios of each of our speakers on the FEDN conference website. And I wanted to offer just a few words of housekeeping before we start the discussion. Please remember that the session is being recorded. And during the panel discussion, we encourage you to use the chat function for any questions that you have. Please enter them into the chat or to vote a question to the top of the list. We also encourage you to use the chat feature to reach out to colleagues for networking purposes, offer additional resources to the group, or offer your thoughts on the discussion. We're planning on 3 rounds of questions to the panel before we move on to Q&A. And then just before the Q&A, our conference organizers have a poll that they would like our help with. I'll offer the results of the poll before the session concludes. So let's get started. So I would like to pose a question to the panel and ask, how have the recent health and economic crises exposed or exacerbated disparities for your constituency, especially with regard to equality of economic opportunity and the voice in the policy arena? Ron, may I start with you?
Definitely. Hi, Barb. I'd like to greet everyone a happy Pride. I'm very much honored to represent the LGBT plus sector in this conference session. And I guess from the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, in answering the question, we feel that this has really exacerbated not just the general public, but especially those who are underrepresented and the marginalized sector of society, such as us in the LGBT chamber, or rather in the LGBT community. And this is quite prevalent when it comes to policy making, when it comes to actual government services, and at the same time to the personal stories that we've heard through the companies and the professionals, the workers that we've been interacting the past few months. Let me begin with at the policy level. It is not a secret to everyone that the LGBT sector's recognition by the state has been quite challenging for the past years in the Philippines. And because the recognition, for example, of union, legal union, of the absence rather of the anti-discrimination law across the country have contributed to the negative effect when it comes to the welfare of the LGBT sector. And I think with the pandemic and the lockdown and the access to services has been hampered, we feel that more and more individuals from our community are facing a lot of challenges. Let me highlight a few things in terms of access to government services. When the government has rolled out, assistance on a weekly basis for people who are staying in their homes, giving them like food packages and stuff, it's unfortunate that most of the cities in the country only gave this to families that are traditionally considered as, man and woman through legal union. And unfortunately, some of our LGBT members are actually heads of families. And because they do not traditionally fall within the definition of a family, they were not extended the right goods or services from the government. And these cases have been are quite prevalent across cities. And it is fortunate that some municipal leaders have understood the importance of a household, irregardless of one's sexual orientation or gender identity. So again, what I'm trying to say is that more and more, because of the restrictive nature and definition of families in our society, the access of us LGBT heads of families have been very much limited. Second, I also like to highlight the role of the workplace in the whole pandemic and economic challenge that we've faced to date. We've also recorded some cases of discrimination, and as some employees, some workers have faced discrimination. These has increased rather because of the information or the lack of information company owners have when it comes to acceptance, inclusion, and diversity. So what we're saying is that it's more challenging to be a transgender woman, for example, in the workplace, in consideration of the non-acceptance and non-inclusion of most companies in the Philippines. Based on our studies in 2018, only 17% of Filipino-owned or corporations in the country have actually implemented inclusive and diverse policies. And that's a long way to go. Just imagine an economy where only 17% are accepting of diverse SOGI. So we thought that there's more to be done, and the pandemic has really exacerbated the potential and the professional growth of individuals, especially from us in the underrepresented. And lastly, when it comes to the businesses, almost a lot of micro, small, medium enterprises have actually closed their doors in the country. 4 million people have lost their job. And it's good that, for example, in the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, we always find ways to ensure that we provide the right information in one way or another and assistance to them to stay afloat, to have their businesses moving, regardless of less consumer recognition or consumer spending towards their goods and services and the like. So I think, Barb, it's equally important to understand that the pandemic is pretty much difficult for everybody, but more so for the marginalized and underrepresented sectors of society, such as us in the LGBT community.
That's great, Ron. Thank you. And thanks so much for the important work that your chamber is doing. It's great that we're able to highlight some of these issues and figure out ways that we can work together on them. Thank you. Manisha, I'd like to turn to you next because a lot of what Ron has raised with some of the corporations and the issues with policies remind me a bit of what we've been working on with the Women's Business Agenda. So I'd like to ask you the same question and to offer your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Barb. I hope everyone so far are having a good time. It was very good to hear from Ron. So as the pandemic took all of us in surprise, some of the countries that had the infrastructure and proper stable economy, they were very much able to respond to it and address it, though it was a surprise. But a number of other countries like ours, like Afghanistan, that did not have proper infrastructure and systems and policies in place, and also on the other side, the conflict and instability, economic and political instability existed in the country. So in this case, for us, it was the worst. For example, not only since we're specifically talking today about businesses and how it really affected the economy, but I just want to highlight a few other things as well. So for example, health services. Health services, we do not have, for example, insurance, and government is still controlling a lot of our health system and health services. And so initially, the government did not allow any of the private sector health providers to allocate their hospitals or allocate a branch of their work, their locations for COVID-19. And they wanted to do it all themselves, which was not possible. We know that governments would not be able to really serve all the people in the country. And then on the other side, education. When all the schools and universities were closed, some of the best private schools and private universities were able to immediately adopt, like everywhere else, the technology and provide online classes. But then all other government schools and government universities, they were all shut and stopped, and so all the students were home, and nothing much happened. And then, yes, a majority of our students are in public schools, and majority of our students are in public universities. So that really affected last year our children to really learn quality, to get quality education. And then coming to the really to businesses, and then also to look into the equality aspect of it, how it affected men and women. We have initially it affected, of course, everyone, like as you would see, the same. But then later you would see that no, it didn't affect everyone the same, because men, all of them, they have their shops outside, they have their carts, their street sellers. And so for them, it was very easy to, after a month, to say, okay, they're not going to abide by the government's rules. And they just came out and started selling. But then women, they remained home. They closed their businesses. And we did a survey immediately after the lockdown, and we informed the government, especially the president. I mean, as high as the president of the country. We informed him of the condition that through the survey, we had found out that 85% of the businesses were closed. Infrastructure is not supporting, especially I'm talking about technology. So they continue providing online services or online sales. Online sales is also not possible in Afghanistan because we don't have the e-commerce gateway, what they call. So people could set up online payment on their websites or Facebook pages and so on. So so we immediately brought this up, and then since then, the president instructed the Minister of Industry and Commerce to put together a stimulus package for MSMEs only. And that was put together in a matter of weeks, but until today, nothing is implemented. It just remained in those papers. And unfortunately, the other instance that happened, part of that stimulus package was providing long-term loans. And so, again, corruption and favoritism, all those kind of things by our politicians is so damaging. So, unfortunately, I'm saying it publicly, we were not able to keep a good relationship with the former Minister of Industry and Commerce. And so when he picked up that piece of providing long-term loans, he only signed 3 MOUs with 3 other chambers that we call men chambers, and he did not include women's chamber. And we had to complain as high again as to the First Lady and the First Lady's office to help us with that. So you see, unfortunately, just like Ron and LGBTQ issues in countries like ours, women do not get what they should unless and until you really make enough noise about it. So, and despite of us making enough noise about it, we got one thing, by the way, out of it. That was a huge contract from the government for our only clothing industry, clothing companies, women's clothing companies, and that's it. And then, of course, we had first. I will respond to your next question, Barb, about Women's National Business Agenda, that how we did it and how it's going on right now, and how that collectively will help us to really address the effects of both COVID, but overall the disadvantaged, the women are being always disadvantaged in this country, so how we can help them.
Thank you, Manisha. I know it's been such a struggle for a long time, particularly over this last year. And thank you for your insight and your perspective. I apologize for that. I have some internet hiccups here today, even in Laurel, Maryland. So it's just been a challenge for everyone, I believe. But I wanted to turn, first of all, Manisha, thank you. I'm not sure if my comments were able to be read on that, but thank you so much for your insight. It's definitely a challenge for women everywhere in the world, particularly in Afghanistan, and considering all that's gone on in this last year. I'd like to turn to Toki next, if I could, and ask her to talk to us about the situation in Nigeria. Toki, please.
Thank you, Barb. And you're not alone in the infrastructure challenges. I'm there as well. So if I suddenly drop out, please don't be worried. I want to contextualize the situation of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In our case, we are a city chamber because we are located in Lagos. However, we've been in existence for 134 years. Now, what this means is that we've been around even before Nigeria became a country 61 years ago. And so even though our direct constituents are our members, we tend to speak generally for the business community, and we tend to carry the responsibility for that as well. So as a chamber, we have a membership of over 2,500 corporates, from the really large ones to the really small corporates. But within the Nigerian context, 98% of businesses are SMEs. So the greatest proportion of our members are SMEs. Now, with the pandemic, Nigeria as a country has a mono economy, so we're known as an oil and gas country, and most of our revenue comes from oil and gas. And with the pandemic, that sector collapsed, that industry collapsed, and all of a sudden, the country stopped making any revenues or any money, and was now in a situation where it didn't have the money it needed to address the pandemic, nor address any of the social issues that arose from that. Now, what then happened was we realized as a chamber that we needed to understand exactly how our members were impacted by the pandemic. And so we carried out a survey across sectors, and I'll just share that with you. The economic sectors that we covered were food processing, agriculture, financial services, professional services, ICT, export, trade, and freight forwarding. And these sectors can be classified into three. So 72% of our respondents came from the service sector, 18% came from the industrial sector, and 10% came from agriculture. Now, the dominance of services is really because services actually contribute about 53% to GDP. Industry 22%, and then agriculture 25%. So there's this huge dominance by the service sector. When we carried out this survey, we found that 81% of our members were very severely affected by the pandemic, and especially by the lockdowns that took place. Now, the special situation that Lagos was in, Lagos contributes over 60% to national GDP. And these lockdowns resulted in a social insurrection that started as a protest against law enforcement brutality, but it quickly morphed into protests against social injustice, bad governance, and the disparities between the poor and the rich. At the same time, Nigeria became the poverty capital of the world. So the government was grappling with a whole huge basket of issues. So what did we do as a chamber? A number of things. We had to begin to have conversations with government about the role that private sector plays in promoting business and ensuring prosperity for all. The pandemic sort of showed to the entire nation that private sector needs to be a partner with government, especially around policy design and development, in implementing projects. So the COVID effort had, I think, about 60% contribution by private sector to it. Lagos state government, which is where we are, actually said that where the health initiative was concerned, 77% of the money to cope with that pandemic actually came from private sector. And the Commissioner of Health was saying to us at a panel such as this Thursday or Friday last week, that they've suddenly realized that private sector needs to be included in conversations from initiation and from inception. They've realized that needs to happen. We ran a lot of webinars for members so that they could open up their minds to doing things a different way, understanding that technology will be a big part of overcoming challenges of the business sector under the pandemic. We had a lot of closed door meetings with government officials, the Central Bank of Nigeria, the Vice President of the country, the President of the country himself. We pulled together coalitions of other BMOs like us to speak with one voice around what needed to be done about MSMEs. Now, what then happened was several funds were started off. There was a huge COVID-19 fund that was put together for households to deal with individuals and families, and then for small businesses. There was another one it's known as COVID that was put together by large corporates and the banks. to help the government in overcoming some of their challenges. But then what then happened? So all of these initiatives were taken, but small businesses were still not able to access a lot of this funding. One was because they couldn't meet the requirements for the funding. Some of them, it was because they have very poor record-keeping practices. They were not bankable and so couldn't access these funds. We found that large corporates were able to access these funds much better and even raise other kinds of funding because they had the collateral to put on the table to be able to deal with all of these. Now, I am not speaking specifically to women and youth. They were a large part of those who were disenfranchised in this process, but there was no specific fund directed at them. They were sort of lumped in the general view of small businesses and families. And these were some of the things that happened under the pandemic in 2020, and we're still grappling with them today. In the meantime, the government's debt profile has risen. They've been borrowing to pay more debt. So we currently have a campaign with government asking them to take a look at their national assets, value them, and start to securitize their loans, because borrowing to pay debt is unsustainable. So this is where we are, Barbara.
Great, Toki, thank you. And I'm so sorry to hear of all those challenges, but it's a bit of solidarity too. We're all in this together, I think. Jahan, let's turn to you as well. And I'm interested particularly of your perspective with startups and the view from Pakistan, if you please.
Thank you, Bob. So COVID-19 caused an enormous economic impact, all over the world, and so did Pakistan also suffer. And this affected all sorts of businesses, but I'm going to focus on my constituency, which is the startup ecosystem, because that's what I know best right now. So if large businesses face problems, startups were affected even more, especially those in the travel, hospitality, and mobility and transportation spaces, or those that provided any kind of services which involved actually delivery to customers or businesses. Because of the strict lockdowns, many of them had to suspend their services for a substantial amount of time. They also had to lay off people or implement a heavy reduction in their pay scales because they just couldn't afford it. Most of them really did not have the money to keep people on or to keep paying the kind of salaries that they were paying. Unfortunately, not much government support was extended to startups. The government did offer support to SMEs in terms of loans and payback time being increased and all sorts of things. But I think startups were not considered at all, which is unfortunate. But having said that, startups in the edtech space and in the health tech space did relatively well during the pandemic due to increased demand, and there were so many opportunities created for these companies simply because there was a need. Now, the population here in Pakistan is over 200 million, and many of them are young people, a burgeoning middle class, increasing telecom and digital usage. It's not surprising that when COVID hit, there was an increased migration towards digital. And the startups that could provide the information and the services that were needed actually did quite well, despite the pandemic. Initially, those in the edtech and health tech space, mental health services. So a lot of them provided them free because they felt that people really could not afford to pay for some of these services. There was medicine delivery, online gaming and entertainment spaces actually did well because people were restricted to their homes. When the lockdown was relaxed and deliveries were allowed, there was a huge surge in e-commerce, with many more startups emerging and growing in that space because, suddenly people had found that online worked. Even look at people like me who have been shopping from Amazon for years, were not using the local services because there was just not a need. We would walk into shops and we would buy what we wanted. And yet when we were locked in, suddenly we decided, okay, let's see what's available out there in Pakistan online. And so I started using some of the online services and started ordering things that I didn't really need because I was just bored. And, I need a computer table, I need, medicine, I need this or that. And I found that the services were quite good. Yes, there were sort of some challenges, and I was not shy to report them to the particular marketplaces or the online store, because I felt unless you tell people what it is that they were doing wrong or what was missing in their services, they could not improve. So that was something new for me. And I found that a lot of people, even the large corporates, were not using digital to the extent that they could use them, because they found everything was much easier. They had people to do stuff for them. They didn't have to go online. They had large office spaces and all of that. But now suddenly they found that digital was actually something that could work. And so a lot of them were working with their teams. They were holding team building exercises. They were trying to keep people together, even though physically they were not together. Now, startups were still suffering because, there was a halt to expansion plans simply because there was no money for the expansion. And also there was a nervousness. People didn't know how long COVID would go on. And so they were not going to spend unless it was really necessary. Investments that had been in the works were put on hold. Many of them paused, simply didn't know if they would even happen. Some startups were very clever and they pivoted. So there is a startup here called Bikea that has delivery services. They had to suspend their delivery services, but they pivoted and established a partnership with the government and NGOs and got involved in the relief efforts, delivery of food rations for the poorest of the poor, that kind of thing. And you could see that because of digital increasing, the number of fintech players suddenly emerged. And so there were many more people trying to offer online payment services because they were needed. And then there were things like, there's a startup that has just recently started, although COVID is now, slowing down and the number of cases in Pakistan actually has dropped to a substantial degree. But there is the startup that is giving you advanced salaries to employees who need them ahead of payday. And so that was a service that nobody could have thought of, before COVID struck. And then there is a startup that is offering training and jobs to people who want to work for companies in the US and Canada, but they're offering training and they are connecting them with the people who need these kind of services, right? So I think these are sort of initiatives that we wouldn't have seen, but this is all very positive, and I wanted to look at the positive aspect, but a lot of people who are not digitally literate, who don't have access to technology, they were left out. And this is something that I think all of us need to address together. It has taken time. So this year has been great in terms of funding for startups, funding that has come in from international market as well as local investment that has come in. So maybe with startups having the kind of money that they do, perhaps they can look at experience sharing, at making sure that they create products and services that address the marginalized and cater to non-smartphone users, for instance, create an awareness, maybe have local language applications, because the number of mobile users in Pakistan is large, but not all of them are smartphone users. There are a lot of people who can't even afford a normal phone rather than a smartphone. So many of them share a phone. So I think those are things that people who now have been able to raise investment should be looking at solutions that work in that scenario. What I really saw work is the community aspect of the startup ecosystem. So whereas some startups were doing very well, some of them were really struggling. And you saw them all come together and try and help each other. And that is something that, young people really bring hope, because they, you see that where older people or organizations that are large don't think of other people. These startups said, that guy's suffering. He's from our peer group. Let's see what we can do. Maybe give them space in our offices. Maybe help them by helping them pivot. Maybe using their services, that kind of thing. And that was just so brilliant to see. So, I think where COVID has been a challenge for a lot of people, we saw a lot of deaths. We saw people whom we knew struggling, suffering, not enough ICU space, not enough ventilators, things like that. But you also saw people come up with solutions, startups coming up with solutions to ventilators, coming up with solutions where they helped older people and where they helped their peer groups. So I think it brought the best out of a lot of people, especially younger people who are out there and want to help. So that was good to see. I'm going to stop here because I can go on talking forever.
Thank you so much, Jehan. And you really started to get to the heart of the second question that we have for the panel, which is, what have you seen to be effective in mitigating these disparities, and what gives you hope for an inclusive recovery? So you've really started to lead us off in that direction. And before I turn back to the panel, I just want to remind the audience, please, we would love to have a big discussion with you, and I encourage you to use our chat feature. So if you have any comments, if you have any ideas that you would like to share with the broader audience, please put them there. And also, if you have questions for our panel, we will try to make sure that we get to them. And if not, we can commit to connecting via email or through the networking app on the FEDN conference site to get to those questions if we can't get to those. But both Choki and Manisha had brought up a really interesting idea or kind of what we always preach at CIPE, which is private sector really needs to be a partner with government, especially in crises like these. And so Manisha, I might turn to you first with this question and ask you about, like I said, what have you seen to be effective in mitigating these disparities, and what hope do you have for an inclusive recovery?
Okay, Barb. The private sector, all the private sector, they really forwarded their support and hand to the government to really help with everything from health services and health kits and everything for the population, to providing food packages and so on. And so looking at the private sector's determination to support the country at the time of crisis, that was hopeful. And especially for Afghanistan, because we, at the same time, we are also in conflict. At the same time, we also have political instability. And so the private sector really proved once again, I mean, they've always been supportive, but once again, that private sector can be an equal partner to the government and everything. And then on our side, we started putting together this Women's National Business Agenda with the minimum infrastructure that we have in place in terms of, as I said earlier, technology. So with the technology, with that minimum technology, we were able to reach out to 1,300 women business owners and some government officials throughout Afghanistan to talk to them about what are the challenges that they're facing and what are the recommendations and solutions that they want the central government and as well as their subnational governments to address. And so the way we received the response from these women and how they enthusiastically participated in the whole process and how they learned to be part of discussions on Zoom, for example, whereas it was so unknown to everyone, or download WhatsApp app on their phones to be part of some group chat and group discussions. Those were very hopeful and interesting, I would say interesting findings for us, that yes, despite of the lack of infrastructure, despite of the lack of a lot of other possibilities in this country, we still can work together and can address our issues. And then now that we have launched the Women's National Business Agenda, so we have 5 offices throughout Afghanistan. There are 34 provinces in Afghanistan, and we have only 5 offices in the major provinces that serve. Those offices serve as zone offices. So, for example, for Central Zone, for Northern Zone, for Western and Eastern zones, and then all other 29 provinces. We needed to have some people to take leadership and responsibility to take forward the Women's National Business Agenda and their own issues to their subnational governments. And so when we started mobilizing these women, how they have now come forward and have created their committees to advocate for Women's National Business Agenda, and as well as for their own issues in their subnational government, with their subnational government. That's also very interesting and very hopeful. And so what we have done, we have started providing them advocacy and leadership training, because we really want to equip them with the right knowledge and the right skills for how they want to address their issues in the subnational level, because of course at the national level we are much stronger connected to the president, the first lady, the ministers, parliamentarians, and so on. But at the subnational level, they lack all those kind of things, and so we really need to improve their skills of becoming very influential people. so hopefully having those committees, that's hopeful. But then on the other side, we are also trying to fulfill our responsibility of equipping them with the right knowledge and skills, so they really influence the subnational level problems to be addressed at the subnational level.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And I apologize, I know we're running a little bit short on time here, but Ron, I'd like to turn to you with the same question before I go to Jahan and then Toki.
Thank you, Barb. I think for us, what I'm looking at is the importance of movement on the ground. And because this is not a perfect system, and government can only do so much, and the private sector at the same time can only do so much. What we've seen for the past month that has become effective is the movement of people who eventually cared for their community members. We have this phenomenon called community pantries, where suddenly everyone would just take care of each other. You don't have to worry about your day-to-day food supply. You just go to a community pantry, and I think it has spread all over the news that we've had like thousands of community pantries across the country. And I thought that was a very beautiful movement. I thought that was a solution to a problem which is so basic: hunger, uncertainty as to whether you'll have your job still tomorrow, whether you'll be earning still, and you'll be paying for your necessities on a day-to-day basis. So we thought that kind of movement was a very integral aspect of, I guess, recovering in this pandemic. And in the chamber, for example, we've supported some of these community pantries. In fact, some of these have been run by LGBT individuals or groups. And it goes to show that in the middle of a pandemic and a crisis and poverty, everyone is equal and everyone can do your fair share, and you just have to trust the people around you. Second, I also think that we need to have this continuous dialogue, and unfortunately at the I guess policy level, we need more representation from our sector. We need more representation for women, for children, for indigenous people. And when when governments are tested in the middle of a pandemic, that's one key factor that needs to be considered. And I thought we've been lacking in that sense because all we know is that, okay, you just pump prime the economy or you just do this. These are all like, temporary solutions. But have we really talked to the other associations, other communities, other marginalized sectors of society? So that's very important. And that's the reason why, on a personal level, I always say that we need to push for an ecosystem, or I call a DACO system, a diverse, equal, and inclusive ecosystem. The DACO system should focus on what the large corporations, large players out there can do to link themselves up with the smaller players. And that's the reason why in the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, when we talk to members that are like already multinational corporations or the big players, we want to ensure that they also provide businesses to the micro small industries, to like a regular supplier. If for example there's a cafe that's owned by LGBT owner, we want them to be patronized. If there is a company that does digital marketing that's owned by LGBT, we want people to patronize these, because the more we patronize businesses of LGBT, for example, it's also with women, the more we normalize the presence of these entities in as contributors of economic development. So I thought the DACO system needs to be inculcated in however way we can, because as big players, it is the responsibility to make sure that they do not just profit or they do not just hit their bottom line, but they also make this environment suitable for the development and growth of the small players. And I think we still have a long way to go, but I agree with Manisa and Jehan. It's all the public-private partnership is pretty much important, but with this not being present at certain levels of intervention, I thought the community movement from the ground is an essential development that we've experienced the past few months. And we're very happy with that part.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ron. Toki, from your perspective, what's been most effective and what hope do you have for inclusive recovery in Nigeria?
Thank you very much, Barb. Just to support what Jehan spoke about, one thing that COVID-19 did was the rapid adoption of technology, and it was right across public sector and private sector. And so what we found was that in the area of financing of businesses, the traditional commercial banks really didn't step up to the plate under COVID, and they created this huge gap that allowed the fintech companies to begin to fill those gaps. So in country now, fintech is one of the fastest growing areas of development in the country. Also to do with the technology adoption, if you had asked me in 2019 whether the informal sector would ever adopt technology, I would have said not in 10 years. But under COVID, the local markets became mobile because of the need to feed the population. And so we have this growth online of e-commerce. E-commerce has become such a big deal in this country that at the Chamber, we established just last month our e-commerce sectoral group. So we can begin to engage in that kind of discussion. Meneza spoke about insecurity. I did say a little earlier, I spoke about the EndSARS protest that turned into a social injustice movement. Now, what that did was it began to show the public the cracks in our security infrastructure. Now, what has happened is that non-state actors with criminal intent have taken advantage of those cracks in the security infrastructure and have started to engage in criminal activity that has increased or heightened the insecurity in the country. Now, what this has done is that it has created gaps in our agricultural value chain because of the displacement of people. And what we have found is that a lot of young people have stepped up with technology, and they're going into hydroponics farming, and they're adopting other technology approaches to food production. I think the other thing I want to say finally around that is that this has caused us to really engage passionately with government and make a push. And so government eventually passed what they call the Economic Sustainability Plan for Nigeria, where they've set aside about $6 billion US, and it's all about inclusiveness and support for small businesses. So my hopes are around adoption of technology in the public and private sector, tighter, closer, and effective communication between public and private sector so we can make things happen, and the awareness on both sides as to what can be accomplished when we are equal partners is something else that has also been established under COVID. So these are my hopes, and I know that that would lead to greater things happening and a push forward for the economy of this country. Thank you, Barbara.
Toki, thank you so much. And Jahan, I know you started to touch on this in your remarks earlier, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your hope for an inclusive recovery.
Yes, so I think it's already happening. Other than startups helping each other, people like the Catalyst Labs Accelerator trying to help using webinars, sharing knowledge, bringing people together. We've also been cooperating with the government, so working with the central bank, the State Bank of Pakistan, as well as the SECP to bring about some changes in regulation. And that has happened through cooperation and collaboration between, legal practitioners, startups, as well as the technology sector and investors. Everybody's come together, and I must say that the State Bank of Pakistan and SECP have both been very inclusive in bringing people together, listening to the problems that everybody's facing, and try and bring about a change in regulation that will help us recover together. So I think that is really a good thing. And the State Bank of Pakistan, which I had never imagined, is also looking at diversity and inclusion and actually focusing on making the banks aware of the fact that women are also customers, business owners, and that they need to be treated as such. And so they're making sure that there are women in every branch of every bank, so that women customers are treated with the respect that they deserve, and that they are helped in terms of providing loans, in terms of any kind of service that they require. So I think this is a great move on, when you look at the public sector, we normally only complain. But there are a lot of initiatives, there are a lot of mentoring initiatives that are happening now. And Zoom is being used, so extensively to try and help young people who are going through depression. This causes depression in young people when you're not able to socialize, when you're not able to go to schools or universities, although that has started opening up. But the mentoring, the ability to be able to talk to someone who will understand, these are things that people from industry as well as from within the startup ecosystem are doing, and doing very actively. The diaspora, the Pakistani diaspora, is also getting involved and trying to help startups in figuring out where they should go next and all of that. So all that collaboration, I think, is great to see. And it's too bad that it took COVID to bring about these positive things happening within the ecosystem. But I'm glad now that it started, I don't see us going back. I think people will be more aware of what they need to do together and how they can benefit each other rather than just themselves. So I'll stop here. I know we have very little time. So back to you, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Jahan. And before we turn to audience questions, I just want to remind everyone, please, to take the poll if you haven't already. We do have a question there for everyone, and I understand from our organizers that some have already started to answer that. But let me take the moderator's discretion here and shift over to some of our audience questions, if you don't mind. And I apologize, I'm using two screens just to make it easier on myself. But to our panel, I mean, we've talked quite a bit about the digital transformation for companies and for SMEs in particular. And the question from the audience is, what type of services or policy support do SMEs need in order to transition online? how are your organizations supporting digital transformation? And so, I throw that open to the panel. Anybody can jump in. You can talk back and forth, but maybe just keep your answers short, please.
All right, I think I'll bell the cat, Barb, and say that we had to start with ourselves. So the first thing we did was undergo digital transformation ourselves. That enabled us under COVID to carry on the virtual engagements that we did, from webinars and meetings all the way to B2Bs and exhibitions and fairs and so on. In terms of what happens in the public space, I think we're a bit lucky with Lagos State government. It's a listening government. They have learned from the COVID experience. And as Jehan said, COVID has turned out to be a blessing in disguise, I really must say. And so the government itself is wiring Lagos State right now to become a smart state and a smart city, which is going to help a lot. And in terms of the small businesses themselves, as a chamber, we push for education around technology. We're pushing for that. The government itself is setting up a lot of training hubs for this kind of thing. The central bank is looking at rules around financial management that will affect financial inclusion at the end of the day and promote it. So there's a whole lot of collaboration, as Jehan was saying, around making things happen. So there are opportunities that did not exist in 2018 that exist now for small companies to make that transition into driving their businesses with technology. Thanks, Barb.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question?
Just quickly, Barb. I think the most important aspect of becoming digitalized and using technology is security, cybersecurity. So for us, that's what we don't have at this moment. And so our emphasis, from the private sector to the government, is to have a very strong law, and then regulations that comes after the law, and then also infrastructure-wise to make it safe, so people do not lose credentials and so on. So that's very important policy for digitalization.
Thank you. Ron or Jehan, if you have any comments too, I welcome those. If not, I've got another question.
Okay, now I'll just add to this. I think training is the key part of all of this, and we're trying to train as many people, both in the public as well as the private sector. But I think what Manisha was saying is also true. Legislation, also the implementation of the legislation, and an awareness that that legislation exists, and for people to know how to report if there is any abuse of the laws that do exist. I think there's not enough awareness created. So a lot of that needs to happen, and people need to be educated as to how to use the internet and technology safely themselves.
Super. Ron, unless you have something, I'll ask one last question.
Yeah, quickly on this one, Barb, I think what we need to understand is even at the digital platform, there's also a lot of noise and news and clutter. And I think for the chamber, what was very much important for us is to continue promoting the players that we have that are coming from the LGBT sector. So, and that's the reason why 2 months after the pandemic or the lockdown was imposed, we felt like we have to start the conversation. We have to continue this conversation, even it's through Zoom, digital platform, etc. So I just quickly, Barb, on that, I think when people look at the right source, that right source has to be promoting the right component. And for us, the right components are our members that need to be exposed, that needs to be supported as they move forward in these challenging times.
Excellent. Thank you. And I apologize, we are out of time, unfortunately, but before we go, I'd like to ask the organizers if they wouldn't mind showing the results of our poll, please. Excellent. What should be the most important priorities to achieve an inclusive economic recovery? The top earning response was promoting entrepreneurship among diverse communities. The second one, expanding social programs to protect the poor and vulnerable. And then implementing policy reforms to level the playing field. And then it looks like offering financial assistance to small entrepreneurs, fighting discrimination and changing social norms, and last, supporting large private firms to keep workers on the payroll and or hire more. So thank you all. Thank you very much to our panelists today. I apologize that we didn't have more time to have a broader discussion. I also apologize to those members of the audience that asked a question that we didn't get to. We did our best to keep things moving along, but what I would do is encourage you to take those questions and put them into the networking feature. Certainly you can reach out to our speakers through the FEDN conference website. And certainly I'm happy to help facilitate any connections that need to be had. So please feel free to reach out to me as well. Thank you to everyone, and thank you all for the opportunity today. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Happy Pride, everyone.